All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for joining us on our compliance webinar today. We're going to talk about essentially where you kind of measure up in terms of what you could expect if you had a CFPB audit. The idea of this webinar is essentially to kind of give you the guidelines on how to self-examine, self-determine where you are in terms of where you need to be. By identifying those deficits or vulnerabilities, you can then address them so that, if and when the CFPB or any other auditor or regulator comes in, you will be well prepared for that situation and know what to expect. Just as a couple of preliminary points, some people say, well, do I have to really worry about the CFPB? And also, by the way, if I'll try to speak up as much as I can today. I'm feeling a little under the weather with a cold, so if I'm not clear at times, I apologize. But either way, there's some concerns or questions people have at times about the fact of, I'm too small, I don't have to worry about the CFP or CFPB, or the CFPB is only working with the biggest institutions. Well, the fact of the matter, and I think this was highlighted really about last month, or maybe a little bit longer than a month ago, was the CFPB put out a press release where they talked about a letter where they talked about how they're going to interact with state agencies and state regulators. And the very clear concept here is that they're going to be talking to state regulators on a consistent, ongoing basis for the express purpose of identifying, essentially splitting up the pot. I'll take these guys, you worry about these guys. Or, we heard about something going on with these guys, why don't you guys take a look at it? They're very much going to orchestrate a network of compliance utilizing both its resources, the CFPB's resources, and the resources of those state regulators. So that's one thing to remember, why all of this applies to you regardless of whether you have a visit from the CFPB. The other thing to remember is there's so much litigation now going on. The Bank of America case, the Wells case, Capital One recently also got hit by it. That when you talk about compliance deficits, it doesn't have to be a situation where the CFPB regulates you and says you've done something wrong. It's very much, or very possible that you could have a after-the-fact lawsuit by a consumer, by a regulatory agency. The other thing to remember is simply investors. The investors are getting much more concerned about compliance issues, especially after the Wells case last year, where Wells was hit with a pretty large judgment based on the actions of its third-party origination channel. So the thing to remember as you think about compliance is not only from the kind of narrow field of what the CFPB or even your state regulator could do. Investors more and more are requiring that a level of due diligence into ensuring that your compliance levels are sufficient so that they're not holding loans that later become issues that they become involved in, whether it be from not being able to foreclose on a property because of LO comp issues, or the Department of Justice coming down and saying, well, you did something with this loan inappropriately because you should have known that there were these deficits in it. So those are issues too. And then lastly, one other large thing coming up when you deal with compliance is that these whistleblower lawsuits are coming out of the woodwork like I've never seen before. It's always something people may have, kind of in the back of their minds thought maybe about, but there are absolutely right now. You go out on a website and type in the words mortgage and what else could say, mortgage, whistleblower, lawyer. Put that in. I guarantee you, you're going to see a whole bunch of pages jump up where there are law firms out there right now soliciting people to bring cases against mortgage companies based simply on the fact that some compliance regulations were not met. And this can come from borrowers, it can come from employees, it can come from every different direction you can imagine. Point being that you have a lot more to worry about when it talks about compliance these days than simply a CFPB audit. But that is, in fact, the standard that the CFPB sets that we have to comply with. talk about some, you guys know who I am, so I'm not going to introduce myself. That would be a little bit cheesy. But let's talk about what some of the focus areas are that we're going to go through today. Policies and procedures. That's obviously a main part of this. And beyond just talking about the policies and procedures, we have to talk about implementing them. How we implement them, how we train our people on them, ensure that our people are fully aware of them, because what happens is it's not good enough anymore to have policies or procedures. You've got to show they're actually being utilized. Having them on a shelf isn't enough. They want to see on an ongoing, consistent basis that they're being utilized. And that kind of goes in regard with staff training and testing, quality control. Those are all kind of also somewhat interrelated in that what they're looking at is not just a question of where I think in the past when we talked about regulatory issues, they wanted to see, did you have X, Y, and Z? It was a checklist. And there's still a checklist, but it's much more focused on ongoing activities than having certain things. So what are the overlays on your QC analysis? Do you have a QC analysis in place? How much are you testing? How are you doing it? With the staff training and testing, not just do you have a testing program, what's in it? Let me see the content of it. How do you prove people went through it? They want to see these types of things. Fair lending we're going to address. Third-party relationships, really dealing with ensure that your borrower is in good hands. Structural weaknesses, and that goes well beyond sometimes even what the CFPB talks about because, and you see it down here on our list, a culture of compliance. When you have a structural problem with your company, let's take an example of a company that has that's owned in joint or has common ownership with another third-party servicer or third-party settlement servicer, again, there's common ownership, and let's just say that the two companies are housed in the same office, they share internet, they share certain employees, things like that, boom, that's a big flag right there for compliance issues. But it's also demonstrating, no company that's set up correctly would have that type of situation. And so when a regulator comes in and recognizes these types of things, it sets them down onto a path of, hey, these guys don't take these types of issues seriously because look what they're doing. Advertising, that might be the chief area where people get in trouble. Not only because it's obviously out there for the whole world to see, but it's the scenario where the DOJ has actually taken a very keen interest in it. There's a lot of ways where you advertise in a manner that the most effective advertising, we'll talk about it today, is the type of advertising that gets you in the most trouble because it is so pinpointed and targeted that you're not only targeting a group, but you're targeting a product for that group, hence making an assumption about what that group needs, and then you may be doing something different for a different group, and depending on how that measures up, there could be some types of fair lending issues that they could surmise from those. And that can get people in a lot of trouble. Compliance documentation. When I talk about this, what I'm talking about are the daily in and out things that happen if you are running your operation in a compliant manner. For instance, let's say you do your QC analysis at the end of the month and you see a problem. And are you documenting what that problem is? Are you making recommendations to fix it? And this is where the compliance documentation really comes into play. Let's say you identify in that documentation that there's a loan officer or a branch manager doing something wrong. Question's going to come up. Where's the discipline for that person? Why isn't it there? Do you care about compliance? Because if you have a culture of compliance, you would have that type of documentation. These are the things that they're looking for, and when you kind of look at how you handle compliance, this is the kind of stuff you have to think about. Not necessarily do you have it, but do you have the structure in place for this to all happen? Are these the types of things you're going to be doing? I recognize for most people in the past they haven't done it. That would make sense since this is fairly new. I mean, these aren't things you had to have in the past. Complaint identification, do you have a means of inviting complaints into you so you can address them? And what do you do going into the outside world to make sure that there are complaints that there aren't complaints out there that are bubbling around that you're not addressing because you don't know about them. They actually say affirmatively you should be going out and looking on websites and finding out what's happening to your name. And then lastly, employment agreements. Not only to show, is compliance part of the employment agreement? Is it part of the duties? How's the compensation structured? I mean, they're going to be looking at these not only just for loan officers, but for higher levels of management to say, hey, is this all structured right? Is there a balance, a soundness in the comp policy? If your CFO or your COO is compensated just by sales without regard to, performance of loans, does that create problems? Probably it does. So they want to kind of see that overall safety and soundness. It's a concept that was mostly imposed upon large depository institutions, but one way or the other, it's finding its way down, so to speak, to much smaller institutions and non-depositories who previously did not have to meet that type of level of compliance, and now they all do. To start talking about this structural weakness. Excuse me. The first question they're going to ask you is, do you have a chief compliance officer? And then, who is your chief compliance officer? Now, one question that I always ask people when I do this, I said, close your eyes right now and imagine that the CFPB comes knocking at your door. And is the person that's going to answer that, who's going to be obviously your chief compliance officer, somebody you feel comfortable with talking to the CFPB? Now, obviously, no one's going to have total comfort, but there's also going to be some of you on this call probably who would be in sheer panic at that thought. And that is not a good thing. I mean, you have to have somebody, and this is your first line of defense. This is somebody who you need to have, who has to have the experience, the knowledge, the training, as well as the independence. If they're just doing whatever the president says and they don't have an ability to stand up and say, no, we can't do that, then they're not a really good chief compliance officer, or at least they're not structured in such a way that they could be. They have to have authority. I mean, what the CFPB expects is somebody to be able to walk into a boardroom, to a board of directors meeting and say, guys, I know this is going to cost us X dollars. I know nobody wants to do it. We have to. We don't have a choice. They want someone to be able to be in a position of independence and authority in the way their job is structured, that they can do that. Then also you're going to need some level of staff. Chief compliance officer isn't going to be working alone, tearing apart files. This is the person at 50,000 feet who is really doing a complete overview of the compliance management system, which is really the term you now hear. And they have the ability to make changes as needed. They report to the board of directors or a sub-part of the board, and they have the knowledge and the experience that is essential to saying, how do I take this company and in fact, make compliance such an everyday part of everyone's job that we can identify problems before they arise, fix them before they arise, which is really the goal throughout your organization of what your compliance management system should be able to do. And somebody's got to run that. That's your chief compliance officer. They have to have the ability to do it, though. Now, there should also be a compliance committee. It's not just to have a chief compliance officer, but they have to be able to report to a group that really has power. So what I mean by that is, let's say the chief compliance officer reports to a group, but then the group reports to the president, and the president has all the power anyhow, and none of these people really have the ability to either effectively recommend or unilaterally impose, either one, some type of changes or contact other people on the board. That's not going to be a very meaningful compliance structure. So that's the type of thing that you have to make sure is set up so that the recommendations get to the people who need to hear them. Understand this also, that the people who are on those committees, they need to, as well as the board and all of management, really need to understand the rules. One of the things the CFPB is doing is they're going into executives and saying, do you understand these laws? And if the executives who are supposed to be helping the chief compliance officer or listening to the chief compliance officer make these decisions and impose practices that are appropriate, if they don't understand the law, the idea is, well, how could the company be compliant It's impossible. If you don't know what to do, you can't possibly do it right. So they're looking at those types of things. The other things they look at are also more general. The corporate structure I talked about, that's sound. General tax compliance. Blatantly illegal practices, employees who, let's say you had, people who clearly had not submitted I-9 paperwork and, there was problems with immigration and they see problems with taxes and there's 1099 workers who should be W-2'd all over the place and they just see an overall lack of adherence to certain meaningful legal standards. You are going to be in big trouble in that audit because they're going to examine you with a fine-tooth comb because, again, their concept is if you're doing things wrong over here that are more basic, that have been in place for a long time, there's no way you're going to be in adherence to these newer, more technical, more specific rules that require a lot of affirmative, ongoing attention. So just understand those are all things they're looking at. By the way, the CFPB will report and does report violations to the IRS. So whether it's part of a CFPB, whether it's part of your general compliance, you want to make sure that those things, if they see them, those types of things are all buttoned up pretty well because if not, whether it's a borrower consumer related issue or not, you're most likely going to get another knock at the door from another government agency. And as scared as you might be about the CFPB, I think the IRS might even be more terrifying. So certainly not a good pair for you to show up at your door. One thing they also look at is data and file integrity. And I think this is a great place for understanding, how you get in trouble and how easy it can be to avoid it. When you go in and an audit starts, first question you should have yourself is, well, are the files locked or not? Now, these are small things, but they start adding up. Do you have locked files? Are the files all in a certain place? What's the policy? Is there a policy for taking out files out of the office? Is it permitted? Isn't it permitted? When it's permitted, are there limitations and restrictions on that? How does the file get checked in and out? How do you keep an inventory? Who had it? Are there rules for when you do have it? All these types of things, okay? Very easy things, not difficult to do, doesn't cost really any money. Have a policy and procedure. You don't have a policy and procedure, and the CFPB comes in and starts dealing with it, and, it's a mess. Here you go. We're already down a bad road. Another related issue is the data security. Again, easy things, okay? For employees who have PDAs, are they password protected? Are the computers password protected at the office? Do the computers time out? Do you have an ability if somebody loses a PDA, do you have a procedure for that they have to call? And then can you shut that PDA off in terms of immediate access as well as zap it? Because most PDAs you can zap, so the information on them goes away as well. So these, again, are these difficult things to do? No, not at all. Are they things that people often miss and don't think about? Yes. And this is the point I want to get across to you. When you miss those types of easy things, I realize from our perspective we're saying, well, we didn't think about that. It's such a small kind of detail that it never happens, but then it does happen once in a while, right? And then you don't have that stuff in place. And the CFPB doesn't look at it as, an oversight. They say, look, if you spent any time whatsoever thinking about compliance, this is one of the easiest, fastest things that you would do. And if you haven't even thought or done this, I can't even imagine what's going on with your disclosures. That's the mindset they have. So they look at these easy things, quote unquote, and say, have you done them or not? If you haven't done anything, I recently had an audit where my client, obviously before they were my client, said, told the regulator, well, we don't really have a trained IT department who handles any of these types of things with data security. I mean, you don't even have somebody there that can do it. What does that say? Right? It's just not the way you want to start these things out. Because remember, they are giving you a rating based on this kind of overall culture of compliance. So these are other things you need to look at. Policies and procedures. One of my favorite things, and I say this facetiously, is when you have a policy and procedure, they turn it over to the regulator and it's out of date. And I don't mean by like a week. They don't have basic things that you need to have in there. You can't demonstrate that you have a culture of compliance if you're not even staying abreast of the law. Impossible. Okay. The other thing I would say is I see these MIC policies, and I just call them these, generic policies. Sometimes they don't even apply to you. I've actually seen people with policies that reference other companies, right? In other words, so we at, and it has another company's name. Disaster, right? That shows there's that it's a game to them. That's how they look at it. And again, make sure management knows it. Make sure when you do your training for employees, the employees know what your policies are. They should be somewhat, look, you're always going to have res patila COA. You're going to have that for everybody, and they're going to be similar, right? They're going to be pretty much the same. But where there are variations that apply in terms of procedures for your company, you really need to make sure they reflect what you're actually doing and the employees understand and know them. Because if you don't, that's the kind of thing that's so easy to test. Again, they're really trying to weed out the people who simply put pieces of paper in front of a regulator to show them how you see we do things, and the people who actually do it. And that's really where a lot of the focus now is going, is trying to determine which people are just, handing you a piece of paper that no one knows about, and those people who are actually taking it seriously. And that's where it's kind of a constant theme you're probably going to see throughout today. Because I don't think when you talk about compliance anymore, you're talking about having X and Y and Z. You're having structures and systems and protocols in place. And that's what they're looking for. And as you do a self-audit, which is what this privacy presentation is about, the first thing I'm interested in from your perspective is, do you have these things in place, these protocols, the systems, the way you're handling it, the structures? If you have those, you're 80% of the way there. There's a lot, obviously, between being compliant and just having the structure in place. But when you have the structure in place, you are in so much a better position, even when you have a mistake or a shortcoming, than not having it in place, at all, or having something deficient in place. Now, when you train your staff, it should be appropriate and targeted. You don't want to necessarily train loan officers on, the great nuances of underwriting, because that's not what their job is. And what happens when you do that is people lose the forest through the trees, right? They get so caught up that they forget what their job is about and what's relevant in compliance to their world. You do want to be able to prove that you provided this training. You want to show what was in the training, so you want to maintain and store these materials. And you want to be able to show that people attended through some type of schedule. And I also think you should have a test at the end of it, and keep those results. Again, this doesn't need to be something like the bar exam, right? It doesn't have to take weeks to study for, or even days, but just at the end of a presentation, make sure that people listened, as opposed to, texting on their BlackBerry or something. And understand, when they go through, when you get audited now, more and more they're talking to staff. Okay, so they're going to staff and saying, hey, did you do training? And invariably they're all going to forget. That's why it's good that you could say, in fact, we do, and here's where they signed, and this is the test they gave, and I don't know why they said that, right? You're in good shape there. The other thing that you want to be able to show is that you're giving them legal updates. If you want to show that you are a compliant entity, one of the great things is when something happens in the law, to send out an email to your employees, say, hey, this is the change, this is how it affects things. Obviously, there are things that won't affect them at all that you don't need to advise them of, but anytime something could or would affect their job, you should be telling them in that department or that particular group, hey, this is a change in the law, you need to be aware of it. We're changing it at the corporate level, but we wanted you guys to be aware of this change as well. So, allow the employees to know what's going on with the changes in the law. With quality control, one of the biggest things they want to see is, how do you do it? What's the method? And is it correct? Do you also have some type of technological backup process? What's the interaction of quality control with the chief compliance officer? Are they aware of how it's being done? Did they opine on it? Were they involved in it? And then it's after the quality control what happens. I recently was meeting with a client, and they said, and there were a number of people in the office, and they said something to the effect of, yeah, I don't think I'd get quality control reports. And I said, you have to. There's no way you don't get reports at the end of a month. And he opened up his desk drawer, and there was it must have been 500 pages stacked on top of one another, and he goes, you mean these? okay, which were basically put in the bottom desk drawer and just shoved there. That's not going to go very well, because ultimately what they want to see is when there are problems from this QC, what did you do? Did you look at them? Did you make recommendations? Did you follow up on those recommendations? And they're going to want to see that in writing. Those are things that they expect documentation on from the Chief Compliance Officer. That's the role of this individual. Now, fair lending, fair lending does change in terms of what's required of a lender based on the way the lender does the business, okay, or does business. But you need, so what I'm trying to say is that there's not one set way of evaluating your fair lending from company to company to company. The standards might be the same, but the way you do it is going to be impacted by the way you run your business and what your business is. So, but some of the things that are important, so in other words, I should say, when you put your structure in place for testing fair lending, don't just adopt what somebody else did. Think about it from your own particular needs, circumstances, and business. And then what you have to do is come up with overlays that are appropriate for that. What I mean by that are you're going to be comparing similarly situated borrowers. Again, just to give you kind of another example of where it goes wrong. I had a client who, on one hand, they were concerned that they didn't really have enough volume to really break it down, so they just said, well, we're going to take, all white borrowers and all minority borrowers, and we're just going to look and see if the numbers match up. And that's all we're really going to control for. And that's what they did. And sure enough, everything matched up, so they felt like, great, we're in good shape, no problem. The problem was that when they got a letter from the Department of Justice that we started getting involved in it, and they were first very confident because they said, look how great we are. We're within a hair of minority and non-minority loans in terms of the interest rate. The problem is that non-minorities were on 30-year fixed loans. Minorities were in 5-year ARMs, and yet they all had the same interest rates. That is a problem. And it makes it very difficult. And this is a company that was actually doing some fair lending testing, but because they hadn't set their overlay up right, it's a disaster. And I would say conversely, on the other side, the problem you can have is if you don't have enough loans and you try to draw conclusions on too small of samples, you can drive yourself crazy because one loan that's slightly askew throws off the analysis in a way that never should have, because that sample size isn't even meaningful. So you have to achieve a meaningful sample size, and then you have to structure that overlay in such a way that you're comparing apples to apples. And that's not always the easiest thing to do, but that's again something you want your Chief Compliance Officer very much involved in from a structural basis at the outset. One other thing I wanted to mention here is I think you have to do an analysis for fair lending both on branch bases and on a company-wide level. So is this branch, compare your branches. Is if there's one branch that's really askew in terms of real pricing and it happens to be in a high minority area, even though the rest of the company is okay, you could have a real situation there. So you really do want to look at your comparative branches and see where they are and what they're doing. That's especially if the company has some type of branch margin applied. Pardon me for one moment. And when you're doing a fair lending analysis, don't forget it's not just about pricing. It's about loan intakes, approvals. There's just another redlining settlement for a pretty small bank in Illinois. I mean, you can get hit by fair lending stuff in a lot of different areas. So it's not just a question of examining your loan pricing. You've got to really look at the approval submission rate, even exception rates, things like that. And when you see problems, you need to follow up with them. You need to have documentation of them, how they're being addressed, and go through it and find out where the issues lie and correct them. When you're doing analysis of fair lending, now more than ever, for a lot of people haven't realized this, and it hasn't made that much news, interestingly enough. But the HUD put out a regulatory final rule in about 2 weeks ago under the Fair Housing Act, essentially saying that disparate impact, which is not an intentional discrimination. It just shows a disparity essentially beyond random luck that applies to minorities in an adverse way. That's enough for discrimination now. And in fact, the FHA rules went even farther, because they say anything that maintains a segregated environment would now be sufficient to show discrimination. Something that broad is kind of troubling. Especially also the thing is that they intentionally didn't give specifics. And the reason they didn't give specifics is they said, well, we can really look at all the employment laws. And for those of you who know me, my background is in employment law. I'm an employment litigator from my my original training, so to speak. And the biggest problem with the concept of, well, in fair lending, we're just going to look to employment law. Here's the major issue, is that in the context of lending decisions, those decisions are generally made based on categories of information. In other words, if a person has X and Y and Z, then they can potentially qualify, and if they don't, they're out. Things done, again, not as individuated of an inquiry. It's about that person, but only as that to the extent that person fits into certain criteria. Employment decisions, on the other hand, are supposed to be totally individuated. You don't hire people based upon, I mean, other than do they have college or not? You know, that might be a criteria somebody has. But generally speaking, it's not like you're hiring people on a SAT score, right? There's not a numerical value like a credit score that you either are in or out. So it's much more of an individuated inquiry. And so when you're applying this area of law that says, hey, do you have a policy or procedure that disparately affects people, in the employment context, there's such a major shift away and such a dissonance, if you will, between that type of process and how decisions are supposed to actually be made, that it makes a little more sense. But in the lending area, it's one and the same in many cases. It's generally not individuated. It's categorized in terms of decision making. And so applying that standards from the employment context to such a different type of area, I think we're going to see some extremely, extremely bad decisions on this, because they didn't, in writing this rule, they didn't understand the differences in the law. That's the problem, because I don't think they really understood the context or took sufficient consideration of it. So that's something you're going to have to really look at. Pay a lot of attention to your fair lending. It's going to be getting worse, I think, in this area, not better. And that's the fun note for the day. Now we're going to go to third-party relationships. This is where you're talking about not knowing your borrower, but making sure your borrower is okay. And that means not just okay in terms of dealing with you, but dealing with anybody who you deal with and anybody you send them to. So if you send them to buy life insurance for somebody, not a third-party settlement services provider, it's just somebody you sent them to. That's why I call this third-party relationships. I think that if you are sending your borrowers to other people, and or those people are sending borrowers to you, and you have some type of business relationship here that would potentially put a borrower at harm, it is your obligation from the CFPB's perspective to ensure that the people you do business with and their customers are going to do business with are all in compliance. And so what the CFPB said in this regard was they directed you to a posting about how federally insured depository banks, what type of third-party relationship due diligence they should be doing. Now this, in many cases, doesn't apply to the typical non-depository or to the community bank who's doing business with a much smaller entity. You can't go to Ma and Pa appraisal service and say, let me see your quarterly financials, right? If you're a major publicly traded company doing business with Equifax, you probably can. It's very simple, in fact. You just go on the website of the SEC filings and you hit click and you've got it right there. So you've got to understand that the way they set it up was from, again, contextually, I think, irrelevant type of situation. So what you have to do is exercise some common sense. Now here's the way I think you set these things up from a structural standpoint, is you want to look and say first, do I have a policy and procedure for evaluating these people, for evaluating these relationships? How do I do it? And what I would do is kind of have an initial assessment period, an initial due diligence period, where you go through, you ask them a lot of questions. You document, of course, the answers to all those questions. Then you give them a contract where you say, okay, you've told me these 10 things or 20 things, and you go through this list of concerns that are applicable to this particular business partner as it pertains to the means and manner in which it deals with your employees and interacts with your borrowers. And so you go through this test, and then you have a contract that say, listen, these are the things we found, and if anything changes, you have an affirmative obligation to come back to me and tell me. And so now you've kind of have this contractual enforcement behind your due diligence. And then every year you would go through and say, hey, wanted to make sure update everything, make sure it's new. I think you also probably want to from time to time Google your business partners. Use the internet. Those are really easy ways to happen, things to do. So again, if something comes up and it's a major issue, you don't want it to come from you don't want to find out about it after you've just referred somebody to a builder and that builder has been using inappropriate products or drywall getting people sick, and it's been all over the news, you haven't been paying attention, and here you are referring people over. Or worse, there's been fraud or something like that where they're doing things wrong. These are the types of things where you can get in trouble. So again, you want to do some type of ongoing monitoring, some independent testing, if you will. LO compensation. Now here's something the CFPB just did, and it actually is subsequent to even me creating this slide. They said in the LO comp rule that came out that the way they're going to evaluate compliance with LO comp is to look at the employment agreement. They specifically say that, see if it's valid. If it's valid and complies with the law, they're then going to compare the compensation paid to the HUD-1s, to the formula in the agreement, and if it all adds up and tracks together, we're in good shape. Done. We're done. You get a pass, right? So this is sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card. I mean, we complained when it came to LO comp, and I think appropriately, that we weren't given enough guidance. Well, I have to say now we've pretty much given guidance. In fact, the roadmap's been laid out for us. Here's how you comply. You have an agreement. If the agreement complies and the comp adds up to that, when you look at the HUD-1s, you're good. We're done. So here's what you've got to be now careful of. Things like unwritten bonuses, changes in the compensation structure that are not documented. Referral agreements, and teaming arrangements, which are now illegal unless they're in the same basis point plan. And source documentation. This is another one where you say, which is, again, this is totally permissible, right? Where you can say, well, if you bring it in from, if you self-generate it, we're paying you 100 basis points, and if it comes from one of our leads, we're giving you 75. Not a problem at all. Makes total sense. It's permissible. But the problem is that if you don't have it written down anywhere, the compensation's not going to match. And then when the compensation doesn't match, we have to start going through this whole process, but this is how we do it, and now you have to prove it. Next thing you know, you're ripping your files apart. And just remember also that if you have certain things like a source documentation, where something is done, validly, but you're going to have to be able to show from an intake procedure that that information was collected. It can't just be, when the loan gets paid, that you're aware that at that point you decide, oh well, this was sourced from a lead or sourced from my personal efforts. So it kind of has to be done up front. With referrals, again, there are situations where referrals are okay. They've got to be limited. You have to have very specific policies and procedures in place for them so that they can be done. And again, very limited circumstances. It's again the type of situation though where you need to have this all in writing. So this is what they're going to look at. The other thing they're going to look when they look at LO comp is they're going to look at a lack of adjustments of files that are quote-unquote in process. So, did you change the comp on those? I know people have said, well, now that we have the new LO comp rule and it says you can do it if it wasn't anticipated, if there was a change that wasn't anticipated, that is a scenario that I think is the exception, not the rule. In most cases, it's not going to be unexpected or unanticipated. And I think they're very much expecting or demanding that this not become the rule, and it is the very, very rare exception. So unanticipated, you're not going to have that many of those changes. So just be aware they are going to look for it. It's going to be a flagged issue for them, and it's not the kind of thing you're going to be able to utilize too often, and you're going to have clear documentation that supports why it was unanticipated. When you have variations amongst LOs, that is something that's okay. There's no problem with that. But if there's variations in the compensation plans, and I don't mean by just the number of basis points. I mean that one person gets paid this way and another person gets paid a wholly different way, and that changes, right, over time. Okay, and how does it change from person to person? Or even if you have everybody on the same type of plan, the same structure with different basis points, which is fine. But what you don't want to see, okay, is a yo-yo effect. So if I had 10 loan officers, let's say it's all the same formula. Okay, we're all going to pay X basis points on volume, the simplest thing we could do on a month. But they're at all different basis points. I'm still fine. But now let's say it starts to vary month by month. Somebody goes up 10 basis points, somebody goes down 5, someone goes up 3, someone goes down 2. These are the types of things you're going to have, I think would be almost impossible to explain, by the way. But when these things happen, you have to be able to explain why they're happening. So when a loan officer changes, and it changes routinely, it's this kind of situation where you have to be able to think, can I justify? So when you see this type of pattern occurring, it's a huge flag from a compliance standpoint. It's not a scenario where I'm not worried. Let me put it this way. If somebody changes, they've been on a plan and they change one time and they stay on the plan again for another year or two and they change. I don't think you're going to really have to explain that. But it's when you have a lot of people changing frequently or one person changing frequently where they are going to really drill down and try to figure out why. So take note of that. See if you have that going on in your organization as you kind of do your kind of self-test here. Also make sure you have policies and procedures that support your contracts. So for example, you probably need a pricing policy. You probably need an exception policy. You may need a policy that talks about how and when compensation is adjusted and how it's reviewed and what goes into it. If that's not in the contract, make sure you do have something behind the contract, a policy or procedure manual for origination that would address these issues. Or if you have issues with, another example would be, I mentioned referrals, that you can do referrals, but they have to be very, very limited and controlled. That's not something you're going to put in a contract, but it is something that you probably want a very kind of like a summary plan description on, where you want to kind of reference something else and then have a much more detailed policy about it. The culture of compliance, I think, is just a combination of everything we're talking about today. It's their ability to see that on a normal, everyday basis, the company is doing something, has a structure, has a commitment, demonstrated by hiring the right type of people and putting them in positions that are, with sufficient authority to oversee compliance and make sure compliance actually happens. That's really what they're talking about. Does management care about it? Does it know about it? Does it understand it? Does it get that it's an important thing? This kind of general culture of compliance is something they're going to look at, and they're going to look at a track record too. They're going to look at when somebody does something wrong, are they disciplined? When people are promoted or in compensation discussions, depending on the position, is compliance part of that discussion? Those are the types of things overall that they're going to want to see. Documentation, one of the things is they've put on the CFRs, and in the Code of Federal Regulations and in the various regulatory releases that just came out, certain documentation requirements for file and data retention. Just make sure you comply with them. I mean, that's probably, you want to get yourself in trouble the easiest way. Don't have stuff you're supposed to have, okay? When they go in and they see things that are there or things that are not there that are supposed to be there, the immediate reaction is you destroyed them, you didn't keep them because they would have been bad. And it is very, very difficult to get the government off of that mindset when you don't have what you're supposed to have. It's a very easy thing again. It's not that hard, but just make sure you're keeping the documentation that you're supposed to be keeping. It's a lot more than just having your policies and procedures. It's things that reinforce. It's the the recommendations, the follow-up, the evaluations. It's all of those things. It's discipline to an employee. It's retaining your HUD-1s when you're supposed to. It's retaining employment agreements for the periods you're supposed to. W-2s, so you could show that the compensation matched the way it was supposed to. All those things. When you deal with advertising, again, for this self-test, I really want to focus more on the structure of how you review it than going, because what advertising needs is almost in and of itself a separate webinar. But what we're talking about here for your self-test is, what's your structure? Does it go past a compliance officer? It's surprising to see how many times you have companies that either have employees that go and are permitted to go straight out into the world with social media that's their own, saying what they want to say, doing what they want to do, or the only person who deals with marketing is the person in the marketing department, and they either don't have general counsel or they don't have any type of compliance person overseeing the advertising and controlling the advertising and making sure other people, employees, are not violating the law. And this is kind of where it gets pretty hard because, look, there's no way you can be 100% on this stuff. One employee decides to put something on their Facebook page, or go to a blog or a website, or put up a YouTube video about mortgages. I mean, if they're going to do it, there's no way you're going to find out about it, and until it's too late. I mean, it's just impossible. But here's what you want to have, and this is kind of the key. Again, another good example we're talking about. If you have policies and procedures, right, and they make it very clear, for example, in your employment agreement, it should say you can't put out anything to the outside world to market unless we review and approve it, and the person signs off on that, okay? Then if there's a problem, somebody comes to you and says, hey, there's a problem with an advertisement that your branch manager put out. And you say, great, wonderful. Let me see what he did. Well, we never knew about it. How come? Because the branch manager violated his contract. That's how come. I've got a contract. I've got a policy and procedure. I make him sign. I make him this, that, and the other thing. He violated every one of these things. I've got a system for why everything gets approved and reviewed. What do you want me to do? I mean, I can't be a policeman 24/7, right? And you're going to be okay in most situations like that. It's where you don't have anything to point to, where you can't say, what was I supposed to do? How was I supposed to prevent this? When you can't say, how was I supposed to prevent this, and they say they have a very easy solution, said, well, did you ever tell him he couldn't? You don't have anything proving that. That's when you get in trouble. So these are things that could, in many cases are easily fixable. Complaint identification. You have an internal policy. You have an external policy. You should have a dual reporting channel. Things in your handbook that talk about no retaliation, and you should also go out into the world. They mention that you should go to the like ripoffreport.com. They use in some of the reports that or some of the press releases they say, because they say, well, even if it's not totally accurate, you'll have a sense of what's going on with your company, and that's a way to have a investigation. Even if it proves that you didn't do anything wrong, it's a great way of just making sure the process is working. I think that's an ideal world potentially from the CFPB's perspective, but I do think that you should be going out there, not just with established complaint channels, but affirmatively going out there and seeing what's going on. It's an easy thing to do. Again, it's a Google search half the time, but just go and see what's happening with your name and the company's name, and if you start seeing a lot of similar complaints from similar people, from different people, that's going to tell you that maybe there is something, in fact, we have to look at. Employment agreements. Just when you do these, you really have to look at this from the perspective of balancing risk with performance for the company's perspective, ensuring that consumer protections are in place and the incentives are there in the contracts, especially in management positions. And think about when you have an employment agreement, does this incentivize poor behavior? Or does it incentivize behavior that is going to be consistent with the interest of the institution and for that of the borrower? And when you write an agreement, write an agreement with the idea that it's not just for you and the employee. This is for someone else to read. Okay, this is for a regulator or a judge or whoever else it is that's going to read this. Don't write it in the way that, hey, I know this person, we've worked together 5 years, I can just say it this way. That contract is not as much for them or even you as it is for a regulator. And don't forget that. And then, the other thing I would say about employment agreements, they don't need to be policy handbooks. They shouldn't be 20 pages long with every rule and regulation. That's what a policy book is for, and limited to that. That's not a contract. It's stuff that's going to change. In these, we're pretty much out of time, but I just want to, raise some things here with you for risk assessments. The CFPB put out, and this isn't all of them, but they put out certain things where they said this makes you more risky than other things, and we're going to thus expect a little bit more from you. And in the couple of slides I have to finish off this presentation, and you guys can look through them, they're pretty self-explanatory. What they're doing is they're giving you a roadmap for when the CFPB or any regulator comes in and says, okay, is your chief compliance officer up to snuff? Is your structure good enough? They recognize different companies are going to have different structures, are going to have different people, are going to have different ways that they address this issue. And that's okay because, an institution with, billions of dollars of assets with hundreds and thousands of customers is a lot different from a what they would refer to as a non-bank, a non-depository that, does 150 loans a year, or 150 loans a month. There's a difference between those two institutions and a difference in the compliance needs, and they won't necessarily measure them against one another. At the same time, a bank, like I explained, a community bank, let's say, that does all of its loan officer or does all of its loans based on referrals from existing customers, as opposed to a community bank that has a mortgage branch in a remote location, and that mortgage branch, processes its own loans and really runs the origination and, gets its loans through leads through a telemarketing company. Obviously, the risks of those two entities are quite different, where things could go wrong, and the ability to control it is different. And so what they said is that when we're assessing, is your structure good enough? Is your compliance management system good enough? It's going to be in relation to many of these risk assessment factors that they put out there. And again, this is not a complete list. It's just, I think I hit the high ones, the high notes, so to speak. But take a look at it, because depending on how many of these criteria you see, that probably means you're on the higher end. And there's a lot of things in here you'd be surprised about. Decentralized branches, direct contact with consumers through marketing efforts, things like that. They say put you at a much higher scale for problems and require more and more from you from a compliance perspective. Just so everybody knows, the links to the PowerPoint and this webinar recording are going to be sent via email by Monday, so possibly before, but they will be sent out by Monday. So if you have any questions, I appreciate you attending the webinar on behalf of C3. Thanks, and I hope you guys have a great day.